This morning, we're in John chapter 14, and what may be one of the most familiar parts of this book and also one of the most familiar parts of the New Testament. You will recognize it probably as I begin to read it and as you read along with me. But I want to talk this morning about how to have help for a troubled heart. How we can have help for a troubled heart. And so John chapter 14, beginning in verse 1 down through verse 6. Jesus is speaking here to His disciples. Of course, it's the upper room. It's the night before He would be arrested and tried. And He says this in verse 1. Do not let your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. If I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way where I'm going. Thomas said to Him, Lord, we do not know where you're going, so how do we know the way? Jesus said to him, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. I want you to think for just a minute about one of life's really bad days for you. I know that's not a pleasant thought. It's not fun to do that, and we try not to think about those kinds of days, but we know that those bad kinds of days come to all of us, right? At some point in life, we're all going to have a bad day. I'm talking major. A painful something happens, a major disappointment, a sudden loss, something that would cause great fear and anxiety and uncertainty in your life. I'm talking about that kind of day, just a really bad day. Where do we turn when we have a day like that? What do we do when our hearts are so burdened and anxious and troubled that we don't know what to do? Jesus' disciples had just experienced that kind of day. And they found themselves with troubled hearts. Hearts that were full of anxiety and fear and uncertainty and discouragement and disappointment. Why was that? What happened to them? Well, you know, if you've been reading along and following us in John. For one thing, Jesus told them that one of them would betray Him into the hands of His crucifiers. Imagine the shock of hearing that if you're one of the 12 at that point. There were 12. That one who sat with you would be the one that betrayed Jesus. Imagine the shock of that. And then they had heard Jesus said that Peter, their rock-solid, strong spokesman Peter, would deny Him 3 times before morning. Imagine the shock of that. And then the ultimate shock. Jesus said to them, I'm about to go away, and where I'm going you can't come, and so you'll be here alone. Something that hadn't happened in 3 years. They had constantly been with Jesus. Imagine how traumatic that was to hear all of that within the space of just a few minutes, right? And their thinking was, we've given up everything for Him, and this is how it's going to end? Right? Their minds had to be reeling. Their hearts were heavy. They had troubled hearts. And so in these verses, Jesus answers that troubled heart. Jesus speaks to their hurt and their uncertainty, and He gives us them some idea of how to handle what they were going through. He gives them help for their troubled heart. Let's see what He told them and try to apply that to our lives, right? Because we all know that eventually that day is going to come. You've probably already experienced some of those days. There's probably more in the future for all of us. What do we do when we have troubled hearts? Number one, I want you to see, and this is in your outline, I want you to see that our help is in a practice, something that we can do. When we have troubled hearts, Jesus was speaking to 11 disciples. There's now only 11 because Judas is gone. So he's speaking to 11 disciples, and he's telling them something to do for their troubled hearts. Now you say, how do we know they had troubled hearts? Well, if you look back at verse number 1, Jesus said, don't let your heart be troubled. And what we have to understand about that is Jesus is not talking about a potential issue. He's talking about a reality. He's saying to them, I know that your hearts are already troubled. I know that you are already experiencing great fear and anxiety. I know that because I know you. And so what he is saying is, stop letting your hearts be troubled. That's what he says. Look at it again. He says, don't let your heart be troubled. He's not saying, now in the future, I don't want you to be troubled. He's saying, right now, this minute, your heart's troubled, and I want you to stop with that reaction. And then he goes on and tells them how they can do that. He says, stop with this, and here's how. So he might say to us this morning, are you listening? He might say to us, in our fear and our anxiety and uncertainty, I know what you're feeling. I know your heart is hurting. Jesus says, I know your heart is troubled, but you can stop with that reaction, and here's how. He tells us how to do that. The word troubled here means distressed and anguished and in turmoil. Think about those words. Distressed, anguished, turmoil. Is that your life sometimes? Yeah? Could it be right now? Is your life like that? Distressed and anguished and in turmoil? And that causes you fear and uncertainty, and you've got a troubled heart. Jesus speaks to that this morning. And he says, here's some help. Here's some help, because I know that your heart is troubled. He tells us something to do. He tells us something to practice. Look at verse 1 again. The last phrase, he says, you believe in God, so now keep on believing in me. That's what that last phrase means. You already believe in God the Father, and what I want you to do right now in this uncertainty and in this pain is to keep on trusting and believing me. I've got a troubled heart, Pastor. I don't know what to do about all this that's coming at me. Jesus would say, above all, keep trusting me. Keep believing in me. Keep on trusting me. Jesus says to the disciples, you already believe in the Father. You already trust God the Father in that way, and you know that He will always be with you. Right? That's what that phrase means. You believe in God. It's a statement of fact. And then he says, continue to believe and trust me. The first thing we have to do when we have one of those days that I ask you to think about, is to keep trusting Jesus. Because watch this. One of the first reactions we have sometimes when those days come is to say, well, you know what? If this is what it's going to be like, I'm not sure I can trust Jesus. Jesus knew that. And he says, no matter what happens and no matter what comes your way, the most important thing for you to do is keep trusting me. Keep trusting me. That's the practice that Jesus is commanding here. Keep trusting Him. So He's saying to them, remember, watch me, Jesus knew what was coming in the next few hours. Right? You know how the story plays out, don't you? Jesus knew all of that was coming. They didn't. They didn't know everything was happening, but Jesus did. And so what Jesus says is, no matter what happens in the next few hours, no matter what you see happen to me, and no matter what happens to you, you must keep trusting me. When it seems that all is lost and that the world is caving in on you and all hope is gone, you must keep trusting me. And so that applies to us. Even when we don't understand what's going on around us. You know, when those days come, we often ask what's happening. Why is this happening? What's going on? God, I don't understand this. And what he's saying is, even if you don't understand what's going on, you have to keep trusting me. Turmoil and confusion, what do? We keep trusting Jesus. Because even though we don't understand it, he's in control and he's sovereign. And he has a purpose and a plan for whatever it is we're going through that has given us a troubled heart. Understand what I just said? He has a purpose and a plan for whatever it is that we're going through that has given us a troubled heart. That sounds like preacher talk, doesn't it, right? That's what you're thinking. Well, that sounds good on Sunday morning, but what good's that going to do me tomorrow? That sounds good up at church, but what about I got to get in the car and go home and face whatever this is? You may think that, but I'm just telling you what Jesus said. No matter what happens in the next little while, you have to keep trusting me. To make it right someday, somehow, in my way and in my time. We need to understand that Jesus has given us this command to keep on trusting Him. Now watch this. But that doesn't mean that He'll give us all the answers we're looking for. Right? Doesn't mean He's going to give you every answer you're looking for. Don't think when you face this uncertainty that if I just believe Jesus and I just keep trusting Him, then He'll show me what this is all about. That's not what He's promising here. That's not what this means. The disciples had a lot of questions, right? They were in confusion. They didn't know what was happening. And even though Jesus said, keep trusting me, He didn't give them all the answers for their questions. Sometimes we're going through this turmoil and confusion, and we've got troubled hearts, and we keep trusting Him, watch this, even when we don't have all the answers. Even when we can't figure it out. Even when it doesn't make sense. Even when we can't see the plan and the purpose of God. He would say, keep on trusting me, even when you don't know the answers. I want you to know Jesus did not remove the circumstances. Watch this. Jesus didn't remove the circumstances that was causing their troubled hearts, did He? Right? Jesus didn't take away what had them burdened, because Judas still betrayed Him. Peter still denied Him. He himself was still arrested. He was still tried. He still died, and they were still left alone. He didn't say, if you'll just believe me enough, all of this is going to disappear and go away. It's not what He said. We've got false teachers today, a lot of them, false teachers, false preachers that preach a gospel that is foreign to the gospel of the New Testament. And they say something like this: if you'll just believe enough, then all of your problems will just disappear. And if you're still diseased and broken and you got no money in the bank, it's just because you don't believe Jesus enough. I'll tell you, that is not the gospel, and that is not the New Testament. Jesus did not remove all the stuff that had their hearts troubled. And that's not what He was saying. He says, even in those things, still trust me. Still trust me. Look, it doesn't take any faith for us to keep trusting Jesus if He removes all the things that trouble our heart. Right? Anybody can do that. He says, even when you still go through those things. I want you to notice the claim Jesus is making here. Don't miss this. We see this all through John. Don't miss it here. Jesus said, watch this, just like you keep trusting God the Father, you must also trust me. What claim was Jesus making here? He is saying these words. Y'all listen to me. He is saying, I am God. When He said, trust me to the same extent that you trust God the Father, what was He saying? I am God. What an audacious, outlandish claim. You must believe in me to the same degree that you believe in the Father. What mere man could say that? What person who was not insane could make that claim that He was God? Only Jesus. Only Jesus. And that's what we see all through this book. So here's the first thing when we have a troubled heart. Keep on trusting Jesus. Here's the second thing I want you to see, and it's this. Not only is our help in a practice, our help is in a promise. Our help is in a promise. One of the things you remember that caused the disciples such distress was when Jesus said this. Watch. I'm going away, and where I'm going, you can't follow. I'll see you later, but you can't come right now. And that distressed them. How did Jesus speak to that? Look in verses 2 and 3. He said, in my Father's house are many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. For I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, there you may be also. There is a promise there for troubled hearts. There is a promise there for the disciples. And there's a promise there for us when we have days like the disciples were having. Yet, watch this. Yes, I'm going away. You can't go with me. But one day, I'll come back and get you and we'll be together. That was the promise. I know you're going through a hard time. And by the way, he was thinking it's going to get a lot worse. But just remember that one day, even though I'm absent from you now, I'm coming back and I'll get you and we'll be together there. It was a promise he used to calm their troubled hearts. Does that give you a little bit of hope this morning when you're going through hard times? The promise of Jesus that He is going to prepare a place for us, and one day He's coming back to get us, and we'll be with Him. He's saying to us, no matter how bad things get here, no matter what you go through, there's a better place, and one day you'll be there with me. What hope did they have without that promise? He was going away. He was going to leave them alone. What hope for them was there if He didn't say, yes, but I'm going to come back and get you? Had He just said, I'm going away, I'm going to die, and that's that. There's no hope or help in that. Had He said, I'm going away, you're going to see me killed, and I'm not sure what's going to happen after that, their despair would have grown. But it's not what He said. He said, yes, I'm going to go away. You're not going to see me for a while, but here's my word. Here's a promise. One of these days, I'm coming back to get you. And we're going to go. We're going to be there forever. And there's help in that. Our little granddaughter our oldest started to kindergarten this year. 5 days a week, all day long. And she was very anxious about that, of course. And her anxiety was rooted in this. Mommy, I'm afraid you won't come back to get me. Heartbreaking, isn't it? I can't believe they're doing that to my little baby. It's a fearful thing to be left behind by someone who loves you and not know for sure that they're coming back. You've experienced something like that. Help for our troubled heart is Jesus promised to come back. Yeah, we're going to be alone. Yeah, we're not going to have Him like we did before, but I promise to come back and get you. And that promise gets us through hard times. Look, this life is hard. What keeps us going? By the way, I understand some of you have strung together a lot of these kind of days. Some of you have reached a point in your life you could say, Pastor, I've got a lot of those days in my rearview mirror. What keeps you going? The promise that one day Jesus is going to come and get us, right? What about this place? I feel the need to address a couple of things here since we're at this text. There's a couple of misconceptions, okay? The word prepare is a place that you can go off track here with a misconception. And there's an unfortunate understanding here. The word prepare doesn't mean that Jesus has been hammering and nailing and cutting sheetrock. Do you cut sheetrock? And paint it for 2,000 years. That is not what the word means. I hear that sometimes in sermons and songs. Well, Jesus has just been working away for if you said this, don't let me offend you, but you're wrong. Jesus has been working away, hammering and building, And He's building you a house in heaven, and it's taken Him 2,000 years so far. And you know He can only build with what you send ahead for Him. Come on, right? Come on. That's not what that word prepare means. Jesus has not been building for 2,000 years. Watch this. John chapter 1 says that Jesus spoke the world into being, right? So He has not been hammering for 2,000 years to build heaven. The word prepare was used to speak of a forerunner. Someone in that day who would go ahead of a traveler, right? A king or a dignitary is going on a trip, and he would send his forerunner ahead to make sure all the arrangements were ready, that there was a place for him to stay, and there were meals, and all of his needs would be taken care of. Jesus used that word here to describe what He would do. I'm going ahead of you to make sure everything's ready for you when you get there, right? He used the same word earlier when He sent a couple of the disciples to go ahead to find a room for them to do this very thing. Remember, He sent the couple ahead and said, go and prepare the place for us. In other words, go and make sure we got a room. Go and make sure everything's set and the table's set and we got food and all that. That's what Jesus said. I'm going to prepare. I'm going as a forerunner to make sure that when you get there someday, everything's ready for your arrival. Isn't that good? Jesus has got your place ready, right? He's got your place prepared because He's the forerunner in that. The other misunderstanding here from this section involves a word that is not in the New American Standard Translation, but it's in some older translation. It's the word mansion. If you use an older translation, it's a good translation, but that's an unfortunate translation of this word mansion, and it messes up a lot of songs too, right? I've got a mansion just over the hilltop. How many of you sung that? Nobody knows that but me. It's an old song. Got a mansion just over the hilltop. That's not this word. That is not the idea of this word. That's a good thought, but that's not the word. The idea here is rooms. Jesus said, I'm going ahead to prepare for you a room. That means a place for you. It's a room in a dwelling place. It's a room in a house, right? The idea, watch me, the idea of heaven is not some celestial housing development, right? Where everybody's got their own house in their own neighborhood. And you know, some neighborhoods are bigger than others. And if you're a really good Christian, you're going to be in the really swanky neighborhood, right? And if we're just average folks like us, we're going to kind of be in the, we're going to be in the fixer-uppers. That's not the idea of this word. It's not talking about a separate house. Heaven is not a housing development, right? We have many rooms in the same house. Many rooms in the same house. In ancient days, in the days that Jesus was operating under and people understood, it was normal if you had a family, right, and they had a home, a family home, and they had a son or a daughter who would get married, right? It came time for them to marry. Well, they didn't always move out on their own and build their own house over here on the back 40. What did they do in that day? We still see that in culture today, like the Amish. They'll build on a little wing of the original house, and that's where the bride and groom will live. And then you've got another bride and groom, another son or daughter. They get married, and they'll build on another wing. And so the house just keeps growing, and each family has their own space within. That's what Jesus was referring to here. It's not separate places and developments, and I gotta go see, you live back over here, and their house is bigger than ours, and that's not what this is. The bottom line is, watch this. I'm kind of being silly there, right? But the bottom line is, heaven is being with Jesus, right? Heaven is being with Jesus in the same place. How does Jesus help our troubled hearts? He reminds us of a promise. Yeah, it's tough now. You don't have all the answers. Life is hard. But always remember, I've given you my word. I'm coming back to get you. And when I do that, you're going to go with me, and you're going to be with me forever. There's comfort in that. There's comfort in that. Maybe you haven't gotten to the place where you find a lot of comfort in that, but you will. You will. So our help is in a practice, and our help is in a promise. Thirdly, our help is in a person. Our help is in a person. The most theologically significant part of this text, the first 6 verses, is verse 6, where Jesus answers a question that Thomas voiced in verse 5. Let's read it again. Verse 5, remember Jesus has been talking about this place, right? Look at Thomas. I like the way Thomas thinks here, by the way. Thomas thinks logically. He's got a bad rep, but he thinks pretty logically. Thomas said to him, Lord, we don't know where you're going, so how do we know the way? Thomas believed Jesus. When Jesus said, I'm going to prepare a place for you and you're going to come and be with me there one day, the logical reasoning of Thomas, the believing heart of Thomas says, all right, I got that, but since we don't know where you're going, how do we know how to get there? I thought this morning as I was going over this about our GPS systems, right? I'll get in the car this afternoon. I'm going to put in an address in my phone, and it's going to give me step-by-step directions to where I'm going. But if I don't put in the end address where I'm going, it's not going to tell me how to get there. Thomas understands that, right? He said, if we don't know where you're going, how do we know how to get there? And then Jesus answers, and what has to be the most theologically deep and significant statement and verse in the book. He said, I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life. No one comes to the Father but through me. You could preach an entire sermon series from that one verse. You could write a book on that one verse, and many books have been written. But watch this. You can topple to the ground entire religions with one verse. Because in this one statement, watch me, if this one statement is true, are y'all with me? If this one statement is true that Jesus made, then all other religions outside of Jesus must be false. If this one thing that Jesus said, verse 6, is true, and it is, then all other religious systems and beliefs and theologies that are outside of Jesus must be false. It's one of the strongest comments Jesus made about himself and about our faith and what it takes to know God and go to heaven. And he's making another outrageous claim that he, hear me church, is the only way of salvation. That's what Jesus is saying. I am the only way of salvation. If you want to get to the Father, you must go through me. And he said that, contrary to popular opinion, then, if that's true, then all roads do not lead to heaven, right? That's what that means. And contrary to popular opinion, sincerity in religion is not all that matters. And contrary to popular opinion, all religions are not equally valid and true and good. And contrary to popular opinion, good, devout people like Muslims and Buddhists and Jews cannot be saved apart from faith in Jesus. That's what he's saying in that one statement. There's a lot of thought about that these days. And you hear people say that all the time. Well, I just think if somebody believes sincerely, then they're going to be okay. Not according to Jesus, if they believe the wrong thing. Well, I just believe that all roads eventually somehow lead to heaven and God. Not according to what Jesus said. Well, I just think that if somebody's a Buddhist or a Jew and they're really sincere in their faith and they're a good person, that they're going to be all right. Not according to Jesus. Jesus draws a line in the sand in this verse. It's as deep as the Grand Canyon, right? And he didn't back down from this, and he never changed this. He never explained away the narrowness of it. He made it very clear. In fact, if we were to read this literally from the original language, what he's really saying is, I am the only way. That's what that says. I am the only truth, and I am the only life. You find for me wiggle room there. There's not wiggle room. There is not an asterisk there that you bottom of the page and says, unless, fill in the blank. Just in case we don't get that, I'm the only way. He then goes on at the end of that verse to say, no one comes to the Father except through me. No one. No one. It's very narrow. Jesus' way is very narrow. Salvation is very narrow. It's not broad. It's not wide. It's not forgiving. It's not flexible. It's not tolerant. It's very narrow. Jesus said, I'm the only way to salvation and to the Father. He's not saying I'm the best way. I'm one of several ways, or I'm one of the few ways. That's not what he said. I'm the only way. Only way of salvation. Our world doesn't like that. You know that, right? Our world does not like that claim to absolute truth of salvation in Jesus alone. Our world likes the idea of what I just said. There are many ways to heaven, and sincerity is really all that matters. Do you know why our world likes that? You know why our world does not like the narrowness of Jesus? Because if there's another way, then I can just make up my own way. Right? If there's another way, if there are several ways, if there are ways outside of Jesus, then I'm just going to make up my own way, and I think I'll be all right. By the way, don't get this idea either. Well, you know what? I believe that Jesus is a way of salvation, but I also think there are other ways too. Now, you think about the illogic of that. If Jesus, watch me, if Jesus said He's the only way, and He's not the only way, then He's not a way at all, because He lied. Right? Are you with me? I know it's deep thinking for almost lunchtime. If He said, I'm the only way, and there is another way, then He's not a way at all, because He just lied. And a sinful Jesus is no Savior. Right? So He made it very clear. He made it very clear what He was saying here. Say, well, what about the rest of the New Testament? Well, the other inspired New Testament writer tells us the same thing. Peter said in Acts 4, I think I've given you this verse just so you can see it with your own eyes. Peter said this, there is salvation in no one else. No one else but who? Say it. Jesus. For there's no other name, what name? Jesus, under heaven that has been given among men by which we must be saved. Peter, powerful preacher, Peter, in the first part of Acts, the early church, after the day of Pentecost, says there's only one way, and that way is Jesus. Paul wrote to Timothy and said this about Jesus and the narrowness of this way. Paul says there's one God and one mediator. What is a mediator? Someone who goes between to make the way, right? There's one mediator between God and men, and that is the man, Christ Jesus. Paul and Peter both agreed, that's good, with Jesus. There's only one way. Jesus said, I'm the only way, the only truth, the only life. Jesus saved the best for last, right? He offered us a practice. He gave us a promise, but then He gave us Himself. He gave us Himself. He said all these other things are good, but when life falls apart and you're having one of these days, you better have me. Right? Everything else pales in comparison to the person of Jesus. You can't figure out the answers. You don't know what's going to happen. You don't know if you can go on. You don't know what's going to come tomorrow. As long as you have the person of Jesus, He says it's going to be okay. It's going to be okay. It may not be what we want. I heard an old preacher say this one time. It may not be what we want, but it's going to be okay. Why? Not because of me, not because how strong I am, how good I am, how wise I am, but because of the person of Jesus. Right? I want to know this morning, I want to ask you, what or who are you depending on for salvation? What are you depending on for salvation? If you are trusting in anything else other than the person of Jesus, I want you to remind yourself of what Jesus said. There is no other way. You're not going to be the exception, right? You're not going to be the exception to the rule of another way to be saved. If you are a believer in Jesus and maybe you're going through one of those hard times, Remember the practice. Keep trusting Him. Remember the promise. I'm coming back one day, and it's all going to be all right. And remember the person of Jesus. Hold on to Him no matter what, right? I want you to stand with your heads bowed. Your eyes closed, nobody looking around. There's always a time for you to respond to what God might be doing in your heart. This is that time in the service. You're here in the building. You were burdened when you got here. You've still got that burden and that troubled heart. I would say to you, remember what Jesus said here. Maybe you're not here, but you're no matter what situation you're in, you face today or tomorrow, how heavy and troubled your heart is, Jesus is there for you if you'll ask Him. Maybe here this morning you have some other decision, some decision you need to make. Maybe you need to believe Jesus for salvation. You've been trusting yourself. You've been trusting your goodness, or you belong to this church, or you've had this happen. But do you know Jesus? Do you know Jesus? Maybe your heart's troubled this morning. You just need to come and say, Pastor, would you pray with me about this? The invitation's open this morning. The invitation's open to